Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more in the Buddha's words. Before we jump into the video, I do want to go ahead and let you know we have two ways to donate to the channel. First, we have a Patreon account that enjoys a monthly subscription rate. Though, if you want another option, I do have a Ko-fi account, which can also do monthly subscription or just a one-time payment. If you are in financial trouble, please don't donate. I'd rather you be able to take care of what you need to take care of first. Please. Everything's tough enough as it is out there for everyone, as it is. If you can afford it and you want to, thank you. I appreciate it. I really do. You know, I'm the only one that does the editing, the content, posting. It's a one-man show, quite literally. But, with that said, let's hop back into reading here. Giving up cravings is so difficult because craving is reinforced by views which rationalize our identification with the aggregates and thus equip craving with a protective shield. The type of view that lies at the bottom of all affirmation of selfhood is called identity view, and the suttas often mention 20 types of identity view obtained by considering oneself to stand in any of the four relations to each of the five aggregates, either as identical with it, as possessing it, as containing it, or as contained within it. The uninstructed worldling holds some kind of identity view. The instructed noble disciple, having seen with wisdom the selfless nature of the aggregates, no longer regards the aggregates as a self or the belongings of a self. Attempting any of these views is a cause of anxiety and distress, and it is also a leash that keeps us bound to the round of rebirths. All the defilements ultimately stem from ignorance, which thus lies at the bottom of all suffering and bondage. Ignorance weaves a net of three delusions around the aggregates. These delusions are the notions that the five aggregates are permanent, a source of true happiness, and self, and a self. The wisdom needed to break the spell of these delusions is the insight into the five aggregates as impermanent, suffering, and non-self. This is called a direct knowledge of the three characteristics of existence. Some suttas seem to make insight into one or another of the three characteristics alone sufficient for reaching the goal. However, the three characteristics are closely interwoven, and thus the most common formula found in the Nikayas built upon the internal relationship. First, enunciated in the Buddha's second discourse at Varanasi, the formula uses the characteristic of impermanence to reveal a characteristic of suffering, and both together to reveal the characteristic of non-self. The suttas take the indirect route to the characteristic of non-self because the selfless nature of things is so subtle that often it cannot be seen except when pointed to by the other two characteristics. When we recognize that the things we identify as our self are impermanent and bound up with suffering, we realize that they lack the essential marks of our authentic selfhood, and we thereby stop identifying with them. The different positions of the three characteristics all thus eventually converge on the eradication of clinging. They do so by showing with regard to each aggregate, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. This makes the insight into non-self the culmination and consummation of all the contemplation of the three characteristics. While the characteristic of non-self is usually approached through the other two characteristics, it is sometimes disclosed directly. An example of the direct approach to non-self is Text 9, Section 4, Part 1, Subsection E. The discourse on the lump of foam, which uses the 5 aggregate similes to reveal the empty nature of the 5 aggregates. According to the standard formula, insight into the 5 aggregates as impermanence, suffering, and non-self induces disenchantment, dispassion, and the liberation. One who attains liberation subsequently wins the knowledge and vision of liberation. The assurance that the round of rebirths has indeed been stopped and nothing more remains to be done. Another pattern that the suttas often apply to the 5 aggregates and to the other groups of phenomena is the triad of gratification, danger, and escape. Text 6, Section 2, Parts 1 through 3 of the Anguttara Nikaya apply this triad to the world as a whole. The Samyutta Nikaya applies to the same scheme individually to the aggregates, sense bases, and elements. The pleasure and joy each aggregate, sense base, and element offers is its gratification. Its impermanent pervasion by suffering and nature to change is its danger, and the abandoning of desire and lust for it is the escape from it. Chapter 9, Section 4, Part 2, the 6 sense bases. The Salayatana Samyutta, the connected discourses on the 6 sense bases, Samyutta Nikaya, contains over 200 short suttas on the sense bases. The 6 internal and external sense bases provide a perspective on the vitality of experience different from but complementary to the perspective provided by the aggregates. The 6 pairs of bases are the sense faculties of the corresponding objects, which support the arising of the respective type of consciousness. Because they mediate between consciousness and its objects, the internal sense bases are spoken of as the phases for contact, contact being the coming together of sense, faculty, object, and consciousness. And then we have a chart, the 6 internal and external sense bases. Internal sense base, the eye. External sense base, forms. Type of consciousness arisen from the sense bases, eye consciousness. Internal sense base, the ear. External sense base, sounds. With the type of consciousness arisen from the sense bases, ear consciousness. Nose internal, smells are the external, and nose consciousness is the consciousness arisen. The internal is tongue, the external is taste, with tongue consciousness being the consciousness arisen. Internal is the body, external is tactile objects, with body consciousness being the consciousness arisen. And mind is the internal, with mental phenomena being the external, and mind consciousness, the consciousness arisen. What the first 5 sense bases of the object signify is obvious enough, but the 6th pair, mind and phenomena, present some difficulty. If we treat the two terms as parallel to the other, internal and external bases, we would understand the mind base to be the support for the arising of mind consciousness, and the phenomena base to be the objective sphere of mind consciousness. On this interpretation, mind might be taken as the passive flow of consciousness from which active conceptual consciousness emerges, and phenomena as purely mental objects, such as those apprehended by introspection, imagination, and reflection. The Abhidhamma and the Pali commentaries, however, interpret the two terms differently. They hold that the mind base comprises all classes of consciousness. That is, they include within it all 6 types of consciousness. They also hold that all actual entities not connected to the other sense bases constitute the phenomena base. The phenomena base then includes the other 3 mental aggregates: feeling, perception, and volitional formations, as well as the types of subtle material form not implicated in the experience through the physical senses. Whether this interpretation conforms to the meaning intended in the oldest Buddhist text is an open question. Chapter 9, Section 4, Part 2, Subsection A, testifies that the early Buddhism liberation requires direct knowledge and full understanding of the internal and external sense bases and all the phenomena that arise from them. This seems to establish an apparent correspondence between Buddhism and empirical science, but the type of knowledge sought by the two disciplines differs. When the scientist seeks impersonal objective information, the Buddhist practitioner seeks direct insight into the nature of these phenomena as components of lived experience. The Nikayas suggest an interesting difference between the treatment given to the aggregates and the sense bases. Both serve as the soil where clinging takes root and grows, but while the aggregates are primarily the soil for views about a self, the sense bases are primarily the soil for craving. The necessary step in the conquest of craving is therefore restraint of the senses. Monks and nuns, in particular, must be vigilant on their encounters with desirable and undesirable sense objects. When one is negligent, experience through the senses invariably becomes a trigger for craving. Lust for pleasant objects, aversion toward disagreeable objects, and a craving for pleasant escape routes, and a dull attachment to neutral objects. In one of the earliest discourses, popularly known as the Fire Sermon, the Buddha declared that all is burning. The all is just the six senses, their objects, the types of consciousness arisen from them, and the related contacts and feelings. The way to liberation is to see that this all is burning and that the fires of defilements and sufferings. The Salayatana Samyutta repeatedly states that to dispel ignorance and generate true knowledge, we must contemplate all the sense bases and the feelings that arise through them as impermanent, suffering, and non-self. This, according to Chapter 9, Section 4, Part 2, Subsection C, is the direct way to the attainment of Nibbana. An alternative route commanded in text Chapter 9, Section 4, Part 4, Section 2, Subsection D, is to see that the six senses are empty of a self or of anything belonging to a self. Since consciousness arises via the six sense bases, it too is devoid of self. The elements. The elements are the subject of the Datta Samyutta or Samyutta Nikaya. The word elements is applied to several quite separate groups of phenomena, and thus the suttas in this chapter fall into separate clusters with little in common but their concern with entities called elements. The most important groups consist of 18 4 and 6 elements. The 18 elements are an elaboration of the 12 sense bases. They consist of the 6 sense faculties, the 6 sense objects, and the 6 types of sense consciousness. Since 6 types of consciousness have been extracted from the mind base, the mind element that remains must be a simpler type of cognitive event. The Nikayas do not specify its precise function. The Abhidhamma identifies it with a type of consciousness that fulfills more rudimentary roles in the process of cognition than the more discriminative mind-conscious element. Chapter 9, Section 4, Part 4, Section 3, Subsection A, contains a simple enumeration of the 18 elements. Contemplation of these elements helps to dispel the notion that an abiding subject underlies the changing contents of experience. It shows how experience consists of different types of consciousness, each of which is conditioned, arisen in dependence on its own special sense faculty and object. Thus, to ascertain the composite, diversified conditioned nature of experience dispels the illusion of unity and solidity that ordinarily obscures correct cognition. The four elements are earth, water, heat, and air. These represent the behavioral nodes of matter: solidity, fluidity, energy, and distension. The four are inseparably united by any unit of matter, from the smallest to the largest and most complex. The elements are not merely properties of the external world, however, but also of one's own body. Thus, one must contemplate them in relation to one's body, as the Satipatthana Sutta teaches. The three suttas combined in Chapter 9, Part 4, Section 3, Subsection B, show that these elements can be viewed as impermanent and conditioned from the triple standpoint of gratification, danger, and escape, and by way of the fourth truth pattern. The six elements include the four physical elements, the space element, and the element of consciousness. Chapter 9, Part 4, Section 3, Subsection C, a long excerpt, explains in detail how to contemplate the six elements in relation to the physical body, the external world, and conscious experience. Dependent origination. Dependent origination is so central to the Buddhist teaching that the Buddha said, one who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma, and one who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. The ultimate purpose of the teaching on dependent origination is to reveal the conditions that sustain the round of rebirths, and hereby to show what must be done to gain release from the round. To win deliverance is a matter of unraveling the causal pattern that underlies our bondage. And this big process begins with the understanding the causal pattern itself. It is dependent origination that defines this causal pattern. An entire chapter of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Nidana Samyutta, is devoted to dependent origination. The doctrine is usually expounded as a sequence of 12 factors joined into a chain of 11 propositions. A Buddha discovers this chain of conditions. After his enlightenment, his mission is to explain it to the world. Chapter 9, Part 4, Section 4, Subsection B, declares a sequence of conditions to be a fixed principle, a stable law of the nature of things. The series is expounded in two ways: by ways of origination, called analoma or forward order, and by way of cessation, called padaloma or reverse order. Sometimes the presentation proceeds from the first factor to the last. Sometimes it begins at the end and traces the chain of conditions back to the first. Other suttas pick up the chain somewhere in the middle and work either backwards to the end or forward to the front. The Nikayas themselves do not give any systematic explanation of dependent origination in the way one might expect a college textbook to do. Thus, for a clear explanation, we must rely on the commentaries and expository treatises that have come down from the early Buddhist schools. Despite minor differences in details, these concur on the general meaning of this ancient formula, which might be briefly summarized as follows. Because of ignorance, lack of direct knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, we engage in wholesome and unwholesome activities of body, speech, and mind. These are volitional formations. In other words, volitional formations sustain consciousness from one life to the next and determine where it re-arises in the way volitional formations condition consciousness. Along with the consciousness, beginning in the moment of conception, comes name and form, the sentient organism with its physical form and its sensitive and cognitive capacities. The sentient organism is equipped with 6 senses, the 5 physical sense faculties, and the mind as organ of cognition. The sense bases allow contact to be made between consciousness and its objects, and contact conditions feeling. Called into play by feeling, craving arises, and when craving intensifies, it gives rise to clinging, tight attachment to the objects of desire through sensuality and wrong views. Impelled by our attachments, we again engage in volitional actions pregnant with a new existence. At death, this potential for new existence is actualized in a new life, beginning with birth and ending with aging and death. But that'll end the actual reading and leave us 3, 4, 5, 6, just over 6 pages. So we've been doing about 6 pages per. Yeah. I'm sorry that this introduction has been so long, but yeah. It was a fairly decent length, and I didn't want to do another insanely long introduction video for y'all, so I decided to divide it into pieces. I'm trying to make my videos at least somewhat more palatable and bite-sized, at least compared to how I have made them in the past. But yeah, that was part 2 of our introduction into chapter 9. With that, as always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. And it can't be just some tinfoil hat sources or a bunch of anecdotes tied together to try to make sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.